Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of GCSP and the Graduate Institute and its Director, Professor Philippe Burin, I have the pleasure to welcome you here in the Maison de la Paix, the House of Peace, at the heart of international Geneva. And the Maison de la Paix is the place where we meet, where we share, where we reflect, and where we take actions in the field of peace and security. And today I have the great pleasure to welcome our guest, His Excellency Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO and the former Prime Minister of Norway. And he is going to share with us NATO's ambition to project stability beyond its borders. And after his keynote address, we'll have public discussions with two moderators, Xavier Colin, GCSP Fellow, as well as Graduate Institute Professor Stephanie Hofmann. So please join me in welcoming His Excellency, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg.
Good afternoon. It's good to see you all, and Ambassador Dusset, thank you for that kind introduction. And it's great to be here, and it's great to be here at this event co-hosted by the GSP and the Graduate Institute. And I would like to start by saying and telling you that I'm really delighted by being here in Geneva, because I feel very much at home in Geneva, because in my previous life as a Norwegian politician, I used to spend a lot of time here, especially in the years between 2001 and 2005, when I was in the board of something called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, GAVI. And that was a big event, or not event, but a big organization, which was very much funded by the Gates Foundation and by the government of Norway and some other governments. And the aim was to immunize children all over the world. At that time, I was not so very much focused on increased defense spending. Then my focus was more on increased spending on health. Now I'm focused on both health and defense spending. So I have good memories from that time in Geneva. In addition, I have to tell you that I also have a relationship to Geneva because my parents, they used to work here when my father was High Commissioner for Refugees and my mother worked in the International Red Cross Committee back in 1990. At that time I had two small children, so we very often went to Geneva and we traveled around here, and I have seen the beauty of this very beautiful city. So that's one reason why I'm glad to be back. The other reason why I'm glad to be back is that Geneva is really a platform for peace. The institutes, the Graduate Institute and Geneva Centre for Security Policy are just two examples of how this city is so important for dialogue, for diplomacy, for education. And only the fact that we have this house, Maison de la Paix, is a great expression of the importance of Geneva contributing to a more peaceful world, trying to build international cooperation, trying to build international institutions, and trying to create a more peaceful world. As you know, NATO is not based in Geneva. NATO is based in Brussels. But our aim, our task is the same as the task of all the institutions, all organizations based here in Geneva working for peace, because the core task of NATO is to preserve the peace. So we are working in different ways, but the goal is the same. And that is to create a rules-based order, stronger international cooperation, resolving conflicts through negotiations, political dialogue instead of armed conflicts, to make sure that we preserve the peace and prevent conflicts. NATO has existed for almost 70 years. I think it was Secretary Mattis, the new defense secretary in the United States. He stated in the hearings in the US Congress before he was confirmed that NATO is the most successful alliance in history. And of course, I totally agree with him. He's a very wise man. But the reason why NATO is the most successful alliance in history is that NATO has been able to change, to adapt when the world is changing. And just briefly remind you of how that has happened. Because for 40 years, since NATO was founded in 1949, until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, NATO had one and actually only one task, and that was to deter the Soviet Union. So the only thing we did was to be present in Europe with strong forces, armed forces, with troops, with American troops, massed along the border, East-West Germany, and also in other parts of Europe to deter the Soviet Union from attacking West Europe. And that was quite successful. And the Cold War ended without NATO firing a single shot. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, the Soviet Union was dissolved, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, and people started to ask whether we need NATO anymore. And I remember someone formulated the sentence, NATO either has to go out of business or out of area. And what we did was actually to go out of area. So we adapted, we responded to a new world. We reduced our military presence in Europe significantly. The United States withdrew most of its forces, or at least significant parts of its forces from Europe. Defense spending went down. And what NATO did was then to be less focused on Europe, much more focused outside NATO territory. It started in the Balkans. We helped to end two wars, bloody wars, first in Bosnia, with 60,000 troops, NATO troops on the ground, with airstrikes. Then later on in Serbia and Kosovo, helping to end the bloodshed there. Then we went even further to Afghanistan, fighting terrorism, and we fought piracy off the Horn of Africa. So our focus was out of area, outside at least our part of Europe, out of NATO territory. So we adapted. Then in 2014, we were forced to adapt again. Because in 2014, the world changed again. And I think sometimes we are underestimating, because it is so close, the magnitude of the change we are witnessing. In one way, I think that 2014 will be as pivotal a year as 1949, as 1989, and then 2014 will also be a very important year in the history of our part of the world, for two reasons. One is the emergence of, that was the year we really discovered the threat coming from ISIL. And I have told many people that when I was first asked whether I was willing to consider to be the Secretary General of NATO in January 2014, hardly anyone had heard about ISIL or Daesh. That was one among many terrorist organizations, but it was not more important than all the others. Then a few months later, Daesh controlled big parts of Syria, big parts of Iraq, Mosul, and Raqqa. So that, and of course, we have been confronted with terrorist organizations before, but Daesh, ISIL is different. Because of its brutality, because of its strength. They're not only a normal terrorist organization, but they have been able to control big parts of two countries, Iraq and Syria. And because of the proximity, how close it is to NATO, bordering a NATO ally, Turkey, and also the presence in Northern Africa. So all of this makes Daesh, ISIL, a fundamentally new threat and challenge for NATO. Then the same year, we also saw a much more aggressive Russia. It has developed over some time, but in 2014, we saw the illegal annexation of Crimea. And that is the first time since the end of the Second World War that borders have been changed in Europe by the use of force, one land, one country, annexing a part of another country. So it's not only serious because it affects people in Ukraine, but it's also serious because it violates a fundamental principle which the security and the peace in Europe has been based on for decades. And they also started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So the illegal annexation of Crimea, the destabilization of eastern Ukraine added to, in a way, the new security environment which required a response from NATO. And I think then NATO once again proved that we are able to adapt, that we are vigilant and willing to change when required. And I will just briefly tell you how we are adapting. I will not mention, as I will not be able to address all the issues that NATO are addressing, but just briefly mention some core elements on how we are adapting, and then I will be ready to answer your questions. NATO is adapting partly by strengthening our collective defense in Europe, and partly by stepping up our efforts to project stability to our neighborhood, fighting terrorism and stabilizing our neighborhood. First, some words about how we are adapting by strengthening our collective defense in Europe. We are increasing the readiness of our forces. We have tripled the size of something we call the NATO Response Force, which are forces that are able to move on very short notice. We have established 8 new headquarters in the eastern part of the alliance. And we are now deploying 3 battle groups and 4 battalions, multinational battle groups, to the 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and to Poland. And the reason why we do this is to make sure that no potential adversary can make any miscalculations about the readiness and the resolve of NATO to defend all allies against any threat. That is deterrence, deliver credible deterrence. And let me underline that the reason why we are so focused on credible deterrence in NATO is that that's the core task of the alliance. Because the whole alliance is based on the idea that an attack on one ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance. An attack on one ally will be regarded as an attack on 28. And as long as that resolve is credible, as long as that unity is strong, then we prevent anyone from attacking us. So the reason why we want NATO to continue to be strong and continue to be able to deliver credible deterrence in a new security environment is not to provoke a conflict, but it is to prevent the conflict, to preserve the peace. And therefore we have increased our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. At the same time, we are very much aware of the fact that we have to find a balance. Because we don't want a new Cold War, we don't want a new arms race, we don't want confrontation with Russia, we don't want to isolate Russia. Actually, we regard Russia as our neighbor. Russia is there to stay, and we are striving for a more constructive and cooperative relationship with Russia. Therefore, it has been very important for NATO to convey the message that we would keep channels for political dialogue open, to address difficult issues like, for instance, Ukraine, but also how we can have more transparency, predictability, because with more forces, more exercises, more presence of military troops along our borders, the risk for incidents, accidents have increased, and if we have to try to do whatever we can to prevent them from happening, and if they happen, make sure that they don't spiral out of control and really create a dangerous situation. We saw the downing of the Russian plane over Turkey. We have seen some busing and some unsafe behavior of Russian planes close to NATO ships in the Black Sea, US ships in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, and we have to do whatever we can to prevent that kind of incidents really creating dangerous situations. So we are addressing predictability, transparency in our military relations with Russia. The message is defense and dialogue, not defense or dialogue. And I have stated many times that my experience as a Norwegian politician is that there is no contradiction between defense, deterrence, and dialogue. Actually, as long as we are firm, as long as we are predictable, as long as we are united, then we are also able to engage in political dialogue with Russia and strive for a more cooperative relationship with Russia. So that's how we are adapting to the challenges posed by a more assertive Russia in the East. Then we are also adapting to the increased turmoil, violence we see in the South. That's about projecting stability. And it's about projecting stability. It's about stabilizing our neighborhood based on the idea that when our neighbors are stable, we are more secure. And we have been doing that for many years, but we have to do more. We have been in Afghanistan for many years. All NATO allies contribute to and participate in the global coalition fighting Daesh or ISIL. NATO also provides direct support to the coalition with our AWACS surveillance planes, and we have started to train Iraqi officers. And we're also present in Turkey with Patriot batteries and other assurance measures for Turkey being so close to the turmoil and the violence in Syria and Iraq. And we are also stepping up our work with and cooperation with other partners in the region, in Tunisia, Jordan, and so on. And the message is that we have learned some lessons from our presence in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, but also for some NATO allies that have been present in Iraq, that of course NATO has to be able to deploy large number of combat troops in big combat operations also in the future, as we have done, for instance, in Afghanistan or in Bosnia. But in the long run, prevention is much better than intervention. So if you're able to prevent conflicts, that's much better than if you're forced to deploy forces to solve a conflict. And the other lesson we have learned is that we have to train local forces. We have to build local capacity. We have to build local defense institutions. Because in the long run, it's much better that local forces, local institutions fight terrorism, stabilize their own country instead of we doing it for them. And that's one of the lessons we learned, for instance, in Bosnia. We have been quite successful in Bosnia 20 years ago, 2 decades ago. There were 3 armies, a Bosniak army, a Croat army, and a Serb army, fighting each other. Now there is one multi-ethnic army in Bosnia. I'm not saying that everything is fine in Bosnia, but I'm saying at least they have one army which is able to work together in Bosnia. I think if we made any mistakes in Afghanistan, one lesson learned there is that we should have started much earlier to train local Afghan forces, to enable them to protect their own country. So the idea of NATO projecting stability is very much about how can we build local capacity in different ways in different countries, not only by training local forces, but also by fighting corruption, building institutions. And that's exactly what we do together with institutions here in Geneva, with DCAF, but also with GCSP, and also with the Swiss government. We are working on how to build local capacity, train local forces, build local institutions. So that's the best weapon we have against terrorism, is to train local forces to enable them to fight terrorism. The last thing, then, so NATO is adapting collective defense in Europe, projecting stability to our neighborhood in different ways, but and together with partners like Switzerland, but also like institutions we find here in Geneva. The last thing I will say before I answer questions is that, of course, the only way that NATO can remain strong, the only way that NATO can deliver credible deterrence and project stability, is that we stay united as a transatlantic alliance. What makes NATO unique is that it binds together Europe and North America, United States and Canada. And after the US elections, the elections in the United States, there has been some questions whether the United States is still committed to the transatlantic bond, to NATO. And I can tell you that I'm absolutely certain that the United States is and will remain committed to the transatlantic bond and to NATO. And I can tell you that partly because that's what President Trump has told me. In 2 phone calls, he has strongly convey the message that the United States remains committed to NATO, unwavering support to the transatlantic bond. And that is a very consistent message from the President, from the Vice President, who visited NATO a couple of weeks ago, from Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, from Secretary Tillerson, Secretary of State, and from the whole security team. But it's not only something they convey in words, but it's something also they deliver in deeds. Because we see more US presence in Europe now for the first time in many years. A new armored brigade, more pre-positioned equipment. So this is not only something they say, but it's also something they do with more presence in Europe. And let me also add that the United States know that strong NATO, strong transatlantic bond is not only good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States. 2 world wars and the Cold War have taught us all that stability in Europe is good for Europe, of course, but it's also good for the United States. So I am absolutely confident that the United States remains committed to the North Atlantic Alliance. That's good for Europe, it's good for North America, but most importantly, it's good for peace and stability in our world. Because the core task of the alliance is to preserve the peace and to make sure that we can continue to live safely in a peaceful part of the world. So thank you so much, and then I'm ready to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Please have a seat. Thank you also for the nice words you had about Geneva, and in particular in pointing out how important such institutions as IHED and GCSP are as you said, instruments of peace. I think we deserve the credit, but it's always good to have some people motivating all of us. So thank you for those nice words. Aren't we happy that you had 2 phone calls from Mr. Trump, not even a tweet, phone calls? You must be somebody important to have a phone call with President Trump. How was it? A long conversation or just very polite?
Well, good, and it was long and polite and good.
And fruitful?
The tweets or the phone calls?
No, the phone calls.
No,
Are
the
tweets useful?
tweets are only 140, so they're always short.
Okay.
But of course you can write many tweets. That's also a possibility.
Okay.
But no, the phone calls, of course, being Secretary General of NATO, one of my responsibilities is to work closely with the leaders in the different NATO allied countries, the 28. And of course, the United States being by far the largest ally, of course, it's important to work closely with the United States, with the President, but also with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense. And as I said, there have been some questions asked whether the United States is committed to NATO. And the President stated clearly that he is committed to NATO, and that has been the same consistent message from all his security team.
Good. So in a way, that's what exactly you wanted to hear.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that remark. We did notice quite a few very interesting points. As you mentioned, you talked about, quote, aggressive Russia, but then you mentioned the absolute necessity of a dialogue, so we will be hearing from you. Let me just make a few remarks as to what is coming now, the debate. As you can tell, many students here, and some of those who do not look like real students are equally eager to learn from you. On your left is...
But how do you don't look like a student? It's the age.
I know. You look like a student. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I don't know if we have a student here. We have a teacher. We have Stephanie Hofmann. Stephanie Hofmann is associate professor. She looks like a professor? Thank you. Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations and Political Science. And I'm Xavier Colin from the GCSP Associate Fellow. We're both associate, so that's great. Before we go to the audience, and please, people, I'll ask you to first identify yourself, and then please do not make any long statements. Questions, please, short questions. Stephanie Hofmann, you are here for a first question, and your questions and mine are meant to feed the debate for you and hopefully have a very constructive discussion. Stephanie, please.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Now I feel obliged to make reference to my age.
Please, no, you don't have to. Get close to the microphone.
Closer?
Please.
Is good? Okay. So I will make reference to it by saying that I actually owe my dissertation idea to an internship at NATO that happened almost 20 years ago. So much to that. And by that, I actually want to encourage everyone here who's thinking about their master or PhD idea to take that opportunity to wonder out loud and maybe get inspired by asking questions to get answers that might contribute to a master dissertation, a PhD dissertation, we don't know. But so the first question I have is, looking at, you talked a lot about the adaptability of NATO, how it changed over time, how it added more functions. I mean, we observe that collective defense, was always part and core and partial to NATO, but then crisis management was added to it and stuff. So you talked about NATO as an organization in and of itself. But of course, by this expansion of these different tasks, it actually took over some functions that also have been done by the UN or the OSCE or an organization. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the European Union. So here in Geneva, we have organizations that do similar things and they sit in the same town. You have an organization, you're sitting in the same town, Brussels with the European Union, and you have a strategic partnership. You signed last summer a joint declaration. So there are initiatives to actually organize cooperation between the two organizations, but you've been in Afghanistan together, in Kosovo together, Gulf of Aden, but that cooperation on the ground didn't work as well maybe as these declarations let us assume. So what do you think, how do you first overcome, for example, reservations by member states, the US maybe, France, but mostly Turkey I assume for NATO, how do you overcome these reservations to actually increase cooperation between the EU and NATO? Thank you very much.
So first of all, I think we all have to admit that international cooperation is never easy. So I was sometimes a bit frustrated about slow decision making in Norway, but after I moved to Brussels, I've changed my understanding of what is slow. So I think, but that reflects the reality that, of course, with all respect for Norway, that's 5 million people, and they can be difficult sometimes. But NATO represents close to 1 billion people and 28 nations. And then, of course, if you add partners and different organizations, of course, things sometimes takes time. So yes, there are there are examples that we haven't been successful, that we haven't been able to deliver as soon as we would like to in different areas when we work together with other organizations and institutions. But the overall message is that we are now working more closely with the European Union than we have done ever before, and that we've really been able to lift that cooperation to a new level. During the last year, we have been able to sign 2 formal arrangements with the European Union, and on cyber and on our presence in the Aegean Sea, where we work together with the European Union. And we had this joint declaration signed by President Juncker, President Tusk, and me in July in Warsaw. Those 3 agreements or arrangements are actually more than we have been able to achieve during the last 10 years. So the last year we have been able to have more formal arrangements with the European Union than the previous 10 years. And we are doing things together, as for instance in the Aegean Sea, where NATO supports the efforts of to stem the illegal flow of migrants. We are working together addressing cyber threats, hybrid threats, and we are working together, for instance, in the Western Balkans. So of course, I don't think that NATO has started to do things that the UN or the EU did before. I think that what we do is that we work together and we're able to do things none of us were able to do before. And what makes NATO unique is partly the transatlantic cooperation that we bind North America together with Europe, but also that we have the military capabilities, the command structure, enabling us to really work in non-permissive environments like we have done in Afghanistan or in Kosovo and Bosnia. So it's not a competition, NATO-EU, it's a cooperation. We complement each other, and I welcome very much that.
Yes, sir, but that said, how in the world are you going to Paris, Rome, or Berlin and tell the allies that, as stated by President Trump, you people, you should increase your expenses? Is this the right time? How do you think you will be, understood or not?
The answer to that is that this is not something which was invented by the Secretary General of NATO or in Washington. The idea to increase defense spending across Europe and Canada was something that 28 allies agreed together, sitting in the same room, around the same table, and understanding that we live in a more dangerous world, so we have to invest more in defense. So what I do is actually remind them on what they agreed to do. So it's way they have paid me for being Secretary General of NATO, making sure that I implement what they have decided that we should do together. So I tell them what they have paid me to tell them, and it helps in the way that you have to remember that in 2014 we didn't decide that we were going to spend 2% of GDP on defense the next year. What we decided in 2014 when 28 allies met in Wales was actually first to stop the cuts, then to gradually increase defense spending, and then to aim at move towards the aim of spending 2% of GDP. The first year after we made that decision, in 2015, we stopped the cuts across Europe and Canada. And in 2016, we have seen a significant increase of 3.8%. Yes. I'm not saying that we are where we should be, but I'm saying that it started to move in the right direction.
Just for the record, how many countries, are above this 2% limit out of 28? Only five?
That's only five. Five.
That's not very many.
No, but that's the reason why we made the decision. Because if everything was fine, we didn't need to make it a pledge.
Oh, sure. You wouldn't be here.
but the thing is that, after many years of decline in defense spending, in 2015 we stopped. In 2016 we started to increase. This year, Romania has declared that they will meet the 2% target. Lithuania and Latvia will meet the target next year. So next year will be at least 7 countries in Europe that meet the 2% target. So we have a long way to go, and the picture is still mixed. But at least we have started to move in the right direction, increase defense spending.
Okay, as promised, as we say in French, chose promise, chose due. The floor is to the audience, and I'll go all the way around. No, there will be no discrimination at all, no ban at all. And please, yes, ma'am. So wait for the microphone to come right to you, and please identify yourself.
Hello, my name is Irina. I am LISC participant here at GCSP, and I'm from Georgia. It's a nice coincidence that a couple of hours ago, NATO Military Committee arrived in Tbilisi, and hopefully with a successful visit. Mr. Stoltenberg, back in February, after the NATO-Georgia Commission, you've mentioned that sides discussed the security situation in Georgia and also Black Sea, in the Black Sea region. So my question is about the Black Sea Security Initiative. First of all, when will it deliver, and what can be Georgia's role in it? Thank you.
So the Black Sea
Security Initiative.
Well, what we have started to work very closely with Georgia. Georgia is a close partner. We have agreed on a substantial package. We have started to implement that already, with more training in Georgia, with a new training center in Georgia, with a new education institution in Georgia, and many NATO allies provide also direct support in different ways to Georgia. So NATO strongly supports Georgia with practical support, but we also, of course, provide strong political support for the territorial integrity of Georgia. We will meet with Georgia soon. I think it's our deputy committee will meet with Georgia soon. The military committee is in Georgia now, where we will have inputs from Georgia regarding what we call a political military assessment of the security situation in the Black Sea region. So we are working with Georgia constantly, and we are stepping up the cooperation with Georgia because we believe that the stability, the integrity of Georgia is important for the whole region, including for all NATO allies.
Are you satisfied with the answer? After all, let me ask the question.
If I may.
Yeah.
Just hold on a second, please. Just a second.
About the Black Sea Security Initiative in general, because there are many member countries who are part of this initiative, and I think that there is much more above the initiative in practical terms.
Yes, but as I said, we are working with Georgia in many different areas, and we are already implementing many concrete measures, and we are increasing our support for Georgia. We will soon then also develop a new assessment of the situation in the region with input from Georgia. So it's not a specific time limit for the different initiatives. There are ongoing initiatives all the time, and we are increasing our cooperation with Georgia.
Thank you. From the left, let's go all the way to the right. I didn't see the extreme right. Lady in black, young lady in black, raising your hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephanie Hofmann. I'm a PhD candidate in political science. Thank you very much for your Peace Center talk. That's what the world needs right now. But unfortunately, there have been several ISIS attacks against NATO members. But I wonder what is preventing NATO from sending out its soldiers tomorrow onwards immediately and starting a fight against ISIS collectively. Because right now, this work is unfortunately being done by Turkish soldiers, and thanks to help of Russia, which are collectively protecting the stability both in Europe and in other NATO countries. And they are under huge pressure. So I'm sure these countries will appreciate NATO help a little bit. Thank you.
Well, all NATO allies are part of the coalition fighting ISIL, and they contribute in different ways. Many of them are present in Iraq and or Syria, training local forces. Many of them conduct airstrikes against Daesh, ISIL, both in Iraq and Syria. For instance, when you now have the offensive against Al-Bab, NATO planes, or not NATO planes, but NATO allies are participating in the airstrikes in Syria, and also that's the case in Mosul. So NATO allies are already heavily engaged in the fight against ISIL, training local forces and conducting airstrikes. Then Turkey, that's right, is more present than others on the ground, because Turkey is bordering Iraq and Syria. They have troops, especially in northern Syria, but also have some troops in Iraq. On top of that, NATO provides support as an alliance with our AWACS surveillance planes, helping to improve the air picture for the airstrikes, for the air operations, and we have started to train Iraqi forces. I don't believe that NATO has a role with boots on the ground in Syria, but I believe that we have a big role to play when it comes to train Iraqi officers. NATO allies can help to train local forces and to assist the coalition fighting ISIL.
Mm-hmm. Tell me if I'm wrong, but my own secret services tell me that this morning you have met Stefan de Mistura. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you.
But you don't require very advanced secret services to know that.
Sure.
No.
Great.
No.
Was there any specific demand from Mr. de Mistura? Knowing the hard, very difficult situation in which he is now with the negotiations sort of, going nowhere.
First of all, I very much would like to commend what Stefan de Mistura is doing, because the only way out of the conflict in Syria is a political solution. But of course,
sorry, you look really strange on the screen. Sorry, I apologize for that. I hope this can be fixed.
But that picture is even stranger.
Oh yeah, that's right. We can see very clearly what your message is.
Cyber attack. Yeah.
It is a cyber attack against NATO.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Right in front of us.
Okay, yeah. But I thought it was more against you.
See, it's back.
Yeah.
Picture is back.
Okay,
very good. Yeah. They didn't do it.
No. No, I would like to commend him for what he does. It's no easy way to peace in Syria. And as long as one of the parties think that they have more to gain from continuing to fight on the ground, of course, it's very hard to find a political solution at the negotiating table. But I think I will only make his work more difficult if I start to refer to exactly to what he said and told me and what he said about NATO's role. So I think he has to tell the world what he would like to tell about what he's doing in Syria. I welcome very much what he is doing.
Another question, right in the middle, raising your iPad. Go ahead. Wait for the microphone to come. It does look like a cyber attack, doesn't it? Please go ahead.
Is it working?
It should be working.
I think it should.
Yes,
thank you.
does.
Thank you for your excellent speech, Mr. Stoltenberg. My name is Aybek. I'm from Central Asia, representing Kyrgyz Republic, in participating in GCSP courses on security policy. Taking into account that there was a big problem in Afghanistan with fighting terrorism, how do you think, should NATO be more active in Central Asian region, because there's a threat of spillovers right now, and do you agree with that in terms of security in Central Asia? Thank you.
I very much believe that NATO can do a lot without being directly involved with military forces, because as I stated clearly in my introduction, we have to help to build local capacity. The best thing is prevention. The best thing is to avoid situations where NATO is forced to deploy forces. So when it comes to Central Asia, we have partners in Central Asia. We are working with them to build institutions to fight corruption, to enable them to stabilize their own countries and to develop their own countries. So that's the general message for Central Asia. When it comes to Afghanistan in particular, as I said, if there has been anything wrong we have done in Afghanistan, it is the fact that we started too late to train local forces. Because for too long we thought that we could in a way be there and conducting the big combat operations, but in the long run that's not a sustainable solution. So the success of NATO in Afghanistan is actually that we, after some time, we started to train Afghan forces, and now we have been able to build an Afghan army and security force consisting of around 350,000 soldiers and police. And there are many problems, many challenges, and many, what should I say, threats in Afghanistan, but at least they are now fully responsible for security in their own country themselves. They are fighting Taliban themselves. They are fighting terrorist groups themselves. We are only in the support position, providing them with advice, assistance, and training. So I think Afghanistan in that context is a success story, showing how important it is to build local capacity.
I'm not sure everybody will agree on the term success story about Afghanistan. Is the destiny of NATO to stay permanently in a country? How long has it been since? Again. Well, interesting. So how? No more power.
No.
Cyber attack again. So nobody will prevent us from talking to each other.
This helps. No.
Okay. No, it doesn't work. Okay. So I was asking you, is it the destiny of NATO to stay permanently, or at least it looks like it is permanently in a foreign country?
I think it is.
Where is the limit, the deadline?
We don't have a specific date.
Sorry about that.
We don't have a
Can you hear very well? Thank you.
We don't have a specific date for how long we will stay in Afghanistan. And what I said is that I think that what is a success is how we have been able to build local forces. I'm not saying that everything in Afghanistan is perfect. We have many problems, many challenges. There is violence, there is threats, there we have Taliban, we have terrorist organizations, and there are suicide bombings, and there are many problems and uncertainties in Afghanistan. But one success story in a very difficult situation is that we have been able to build actually from scratch Afghan security force, which are suffering casualties, which are suffering many, which are confronted with many challenges, but which at least is able to be fully responsible for the security in their own country, and I think that's a big step forward. You have to remember that not so many years ago, NATO had 140,000 troops in combat operations in Afghanistan. Now we have 13,000 troops in train, assist, and advise activities in Afghanistan, and that's a big, big difference. How long we will have train, assist, and advise presence in Afghanistan, no one can tell you, but I think it's much more sustainable to train them to fight Taliban themselves instead of we being there with NATO forces doing that fight for them.
Stephanie, go ahead.
If I may. So you said you don't have to necessarily be militarily present, but you're going to do capacity building in other ways. But talking about Central Asia, for example, we have the Collective Security Treaty Organization. I'm going back to interorganizational relations, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, who are also active in this region. So how do you coordinate among those?
First of all, there is no contradiction between, for instance, being part of some of these organizations you mentioned and working with NATO. We have several nations in the Caucasus and Central Asia, which are also then partners of NATO, and we do what they, we don't force ourselves into these countries. If they want to work with us, for instance, on fighting corruption in the armed forces, well, then we do that. And we work with institutions here in Geneva to, for instance, as we're calling building integrity, to help them to fight corruption. And sometimes I believe it's much more important to be able to build good institutions, fight corruption. That's the best way to stabilize your country. And therefore we work with them, but they have to ask for our help and assistance. If they ask, we do whatever we can to help them.
The gentleman there with the black tie. No, is it black? No, sorry. It's not black, it's purple.
You have a red tie, but you can try.
It's purple.
Purple. Then.
Go ahead.
But the man behind has a red. There's no one with a black tie there, actually.
What was that?
No one with a black tie.
No.
But you said the man with black tie.
No, it's purple.
Oh,
It's purple.
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
My name is Sikandar Shuja. I'm from Afghanistan, working with the Afghanistan Permanent Mission in Geneva. And I'm an ex-student of GCSP Geneva Centre for Security Policy. Mr. Secretary General, I would like to know about that. Has NATO committed to support Afghanistan for any kind of threat from outside? If it's yes, I would like to know your comment regarding the recent interfere of Pakistan to Afghanistan, actually the recent bomb blast of Pakistan to Afghanistan, as well as recently President Putin visited Tajikistan and they are trying to make allies with Taliban. And what do you think that to fight against Daesh, actually to make allies with Taliban, and what do you think? Don't you think that Afghanistan will be a battlefield, just like Syria, in the coming years? Thank you.
It depends a bit what you mean about the question. Also, we don't have security guarantees for Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not covered by our Article 5 or our collective defense clause. But what we do is that we support the Afghans to build their own security forces, being able to address many different threats and challenges from different places. So I think the best thing we can do is exactly to continue to do what we do, to strengthen the Afghan army and security forces, 350,000 soldiers and police. I mentioned that we have 30,000 trainers, advisors in Afghanistan. I met, for instance, with some young female pilots, and that was really, encouraging to see how in a country where women were hardly allowed into school not so many years ago, NATO has now helped to develop Afghan Air Force, training women pilots and the air crew for their Air Force. I met with them in Kabul, and that was really touching to see how that is changing Afghanistan. then, in addition to train and assist and advise with our 30,000 troops there, we also provide funding for the Afghan army and security forces. Billions of dollars. We just pledged to continue to fund them through 2020, and we have developed our political partnership with Afghanistan. So we support Afghanistan in many different ways, enabling them to protect themselves also against threats from the outside.
Thank you. Let's go somewhere else. Yes, sir, right there, third row from the top.
I'm Cornelio Sommaruga, former president of ICRC. Thank you for your talk, Secretary General. I am very pleased to see you here because I had many friendly contacts with your father when he was High Commissioner for Refugees and then Foreign Minister of Norway. I have two questions. The first one is on Bosnia. You referred to Bosnia 20 years ago, and I would like to say that I commend NATO because the war was stopped because of the intervention of NATO. We were, as ICRC, very present. You spoke about the new united army of Bosnia that the NATO helped to construct. Now, in the situation of a country that has been so strangely constructed by the Dayton Agreement, there are still very many tensions. And my question is, what is your role now for security in Bosnia? My second very short question relates to Russia. You have spoken about aggressive Russia, but also of a dialogue. What do you say about the special friendly dialogue of Turkey with Russia? Thank you.
Okay, from Afghanistan to Bosnia to Russia, of course, and Turkey now.
First of all, I will tell my father later on today that I met you here, because I phone him every day. So that's my relationship. It's a very close family relationship. So I will phone him on the way to the airport. Yeah. Then the next thing is that NATO's role in Bosnia. Well, we had tens of thousands of troops there, but now what we have now is a headquarters, which is quite big. I think it's, I can't remember the exact number, but we have a presence in Bosnia, and I met with the people there just some few weeks ago. And what they do is that they help to build capacity, meaning help to build defense institutions, fight corruption, modernize the armed forces of Bosnia, training, and so on. So we are still present, but of course in a very different way compared to what we were some years ago. And again, the less NATO is needed, the more successful we are in a way. The aim is not to stay, the aim is to be able to leave. But we remain with some presence in Bosnia. We work closely with the European Union to implement reforms and to try to address the tensions. I agree with you. There are many tensions in Bosnia, and there are also reasons to be concerned about that the conflicts can re-emerge. But at least there is some kind of stability, and there is a united army, multi-ethnic army, which is of great importance. Regarding Turkey? Yeah, then on Turkey and Russia, yeah, I think it is important to remember that a year ago, or in 2015, we had in November the downing of the Russian plane over Turkey. Then we all were very concerned about tensions between Turkey and Russia. I was among those that called for direct dialogue contact Turkey-Russia. I welcome the fact that they are talking to each other. Not least because Turkey is present in northern Syria, Russia is present in Syria. We have to avoid any kind of conflict, misunderstanding, miscalculation, to avoid dangerous incidents, accidents for happening there. Turkey is a valued ally. Turkey participates in our different operations and missions, but I think the fact that they are talking to Turkey is something that is actually reducing the risks of miscalculation, misunderstanding.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have another 22 minutes. So again, short questions. Try to make the answers a little bit shorter so we can have more and more people. Thank you. I'm glad the screens are working now. We look better. Sir, right here. You've been raising your hand for quite a while.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Oh, hold on a second.
Yes,
Yeah.
Mr. Secretary General, good afternoon. My name is Evgeny Sharov. I'm specialist on NATO from Ukraine and alumni of senior course Rome NATO Defense College. So my question is, because of NATO projection of stability without Article 5, Georgia lost Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Ukraine lost Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk, territory roughly of Belgium, without any chance next 15 years to become a members of alliance. Most striking, here in Geneva Centre, there is a analysis that tells that Poroshenko teams in the process of hidden mobilization for war with Russia, which will happen with civil war and flow of refugees up to 5 million in July, August this year. Is NATO ready to take full responsibility for endangering security of Europe and manage this biggest in European history humanitarian crisis? Or NATO send quick signal to Poroshenko, stop provoking Russia and consider neutrality of Swiss type or non-block? Thank you very much.
It's up to Ukraine to decide. We will not tell Ukraine what they should do. If Ukraine wants to be a neutral country, well, then Ukraine is a neutral country. We respect that neutrality totally if they want to be neutral, as we respect the neutrality of Sweden, Finland, Switzerland. So if a country, through democratic processes, decide that they would like to be neutral, fine, no problem. But if a country, through democratic processes, decide that they would like to apply for membership in NATO, that's also fine. Because it's not for NATO, it's not for big powers to decide what different countries would like to do. They have the sovereign right to decide their own path. And that is a core principle which all countries, including Russia, has assigned to, for instance, in the Helsinki Final Act. So I'm a bit confused about what actually you are saying, but if you are saying that NATO should tell Ukraine that we will not, you are not allowed in a way to ask for membership, well, that's up to Ukraine to decide. The whole idea that, in a way, big powers have some kind of right to decide what smaller nations or older nations in Europe can do or not do is wrong. If Ukraine wants to apply for membership, that's up to Ukraine to decide, and of course NATO has to decide among our 28 allies, or soon to be 29, whether Ukraine meets the standards and is ready for membership. No one else has the right to try to intervene in that process.
The lady there who's raising her hand. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Tween Ewan. I'm a policy officer covering disarmament and international security at the Australian Permanent Mission. Thank you, Secretary General, very much for your comprehensive briefing on NATO's priorities. Given, cyber attacks playing before our very eyes, my question relates to cyber. I understand cyber defence is NATO's a core task of NATO's collective defence. So I was just curious as to what are the parameters or the requirements that need to trigger an Article 5 collective defence if there was a cyber attack, and how does NATO define a cyber attack? Thank you very much.
Has it happened already on a major scale?
It depends a bit what you mean about major scale. There have been many cyber attacks against NATO networks and against NATO allies. We have seen cyber attacks against the German Parliament, the French drone fleet, French TV station, and last year we saw on average 500 incidents against NATO networks which required a response from our experts. And that's 60% more than in 2015. So we have seen an increase in cyber attacks, both when it comes to numbers, sophistication, and different kinds of attacks against different networks. So yes, that has happened large scale against many NATO allies. We have decided that a cyber attack, since it can be as dangerous, as damaging as a kinetic attack or a conventional attack, can trigger Article 5. But we will never exactly define what will trigger Article 5, because then it's in a way possible to play with that definition and to move just up to the limit. So at the end, that requires a request from the nation which is under attack and an assessment by NATO allies whether we will trigger the collective defense clause.
Sir, third row, wait for the microphone to come.
Thank you, Secretary General. Michael Parmley, retired American diplomat, where one of my responsibilities was as Office Director for Nordic and Baltic Affairs, and I had many occasions to visit Oslo, and great admirer of your country. An element I didn't hear you mention in your brilliant opening remarks, the impact of Brexit on European security. I realize Brexit is only regarding European Union, but I've heard some people say, well, no, now is the time for Europe defense to rush forward. Or, any comment on that?
As you said, Brexit changes the United Kingdom's relationship with the European Union, but it does not change the United Kingdom's relationship with NATO. Second, I think that Brexit just underscores the importance of NATO, binding together non-EU members and EU members, both in Europe and across the Atlantic. And therefore, we are looking into how we can strengthen the cooperation with the European Union. We are doing a lot. Third, I think that Brexit illustrates that I welcome very much stronger European defense, stronger EU also investments in defense, as long as it complements what NATO does, but not duplicate what NATO does. So the important thing is exactly how this is done. And therefore I welcome that we have a close dialogue with the European Union exactly on that. And from the European Union, it has been very clearly stated that European defense is not about creating a European army. It's not about creating new command structures, so duplicating NATO structures. And it's not about the European Union starting to do a collective defense. But as long as European defense is about investing more in defense, coordinating more the efforts of European NATO allies and EU members, then I welcome it. Or new European capabilities is something we have called for a long time. So as long as it's complementarity, not competition, I just welcome more European defense.
Stephanie, you wanted to come in at that
But how
stage?
can we assure this? Because, I mean, the UK actually, within the European Union, was the country who was blocking more headquarter structures, for example, being built in the European Union. Now that Brexit is more or less on the table, I mean, it still will take 2 years, but the French and the German governments already have taken initiatives to push for headquarter structures in the European Union. There's no guarantee whether it will be complementary or actually competitive in the end. And it might vary depending on who's in power in various countries pushing for certain interests. So I'm just wondering, I really appreciate that that the optimist and that multilateralism is something that you seem to be very driven by. But there's, for me, no guarantee that it's actually going to work.
No, but the reality is that in democratic societies and in real life, you very seldom have guarantees. So if you wait for guarantees, you can go to bed in a way, because it will never happen. So I'm not saying that you should go to bed, but the thing is that guarantees doesn't exist. It's very hard to have total guarantees in democratic processes. But I am absolutely confident that what NATO and the EU does will complement each other, because it is in the interest of the European Union. As I think it was the German Defense Secretary or Minister, she said that to have competition between the European Union and NATO will be as competing with ourselves. Because for Germany, they are both in NATO and in the European Union. And why should they want a competition between NATO and the European Union?
So is France.
Yes, but at least I agree with you. You never. I cannot guarantee you, but I believe and I'm convinced that it's possible to develop stronger European defenses, more cooperation in the European Union on defense, without competing with NATO, but complementing NATO. Because if, for instance, the European Union is able to do more on defense spending, more on research, more on coordinating their defense industries, then that's something which will be good for Europe, good for European Union, and good for NATO. But we have to be aware of the risks. We have to be aware of the pitfalls, and therefore I also welcome the very close cooperation between NATO and the EU on these issues to avoid that they start to duplicate what we do.
Gentleman all the way up, he's been waiting for quite a while.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General.
Could you stand up so that we see you? Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Peter Hall. You've stressed a lot about increase in defense expenditure. Because of my name, I'm concerned about robbing Peter to pay Paul. A group of major generals in the US last week and former generals stated very clearly that foreign aid is as important as military expenditure. And yet we know the US is going to be cutting back on foreign aid to build its military expenditure. We know that with the Conservative government in Britain, they've been taking security funding out of the aid budget, out of DFID funds for the past few years. What's your attitude to this balance between foreign aid and military expenditure, particularly given your former hat, where you were, as a Norwegian Prime Minister, a major exponent of foreign aid?
So, as Secretary General of NATO, my responsibility is, of course, security, defense. So I don't have a mandate in a way to address the question of foreign aid. But I can tell you that as a former Norwegian politician, I still have the opinion that foreign aid is important. And I welcome, for instance, the United Kingdom, which meets both the international guidelines on development aid, spending 0.7% of GDP on foreign aid, and at the same time meets the NATO guideline on defense spending 2% of GDP on defense. So for me, the United Kingdom illustrates that it is possible both to meet the foreign aid guidelines or targets, and at the same time to meet the defense guidelines or targets. The thing is that, in one way, the fact that we have to spend more on defense is a bad signal, because it says something about a more dangerous world. I have often told people that when I was Minister of Finance in Norway back in the 1990s, I was responsible for cutting defense spending in Norway. I was quite proud of being very clever at that. But when I was Prime Minister later on, I also started to increase defense spending in Norway after 2008 and the Russian aggression against Georgia. So the thing is that we should spend as little as possible on defense, but we need to spend enough, because we need to be strong enough to deter, to deliver credible deterrence. And now we need to spend more, because we live in a more dangerous world.
We have 5 more minutes to go. Madam, with the... Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Claire Somerville. I'm the Executive Director of the Gender Centre here at the Graduate Institute. I'd like to pick up on your comment earlier about the pilots, the women pilots in Afghanistan. In particular, I'd like to invite you to comment upon the implementation of 1325. And specifically, what do you see as the barriers going forward to further progress on 1325? Thank you.
So 1325 is about women, peace and security, and that is something which is high on the agenda for NATO. I have a special advisor on gender and peace and security. What we can do is that we can, in all our programs for education, for training, for building institutions, we have 40 partners, and we work with many of them exactly on all issues related to gender, women, peace and security. Some help us with training, like for instance Switzerland, and some are recipient countries, and we help them to train their forces and making gender part of that training. So again, one of the important, as I say, tasks of NATO when we train Iraqi forces, or when we train Afghani forces, or when we are present in Jordan or Tunisia, is to also have the gender perspective, protection of civilians as part of that education.
Almost the last question, please. Ma'am, go ahead. I'll take just one more question afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm a student.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Closer.
Closer to the mic.
I'm a student in military studies in the Academy Sandhurst in London. Okay, my question is, what measures have been taken by NATO in terms of the modern warfare technologies to prevent election tampering and interference, with respect to the fact that very soon in Europe there's going to be 2 immediate forthcoming elections, namely France and the Netherlands? Thank you.
I don't think France needs a cyber attack or anything, and more than they have already.
So what we do is that we work together with all allies to increase the awareness, the understanding of the cyber threat. And we see a combination of propaganda, of disinformation and cyber attacks. And that's, of course, a very dangerous mix. The first responder is, of course, nations, because they have capabilities, they have knowledge. What we do is to help them to develop their capabilities and their cyber defenses and their knowledge about the dangers. Our message is that we should not meet propaganda with propaganda. What we should do is to provide the facts, the truth. Because I'm absolutely certain that in the long run, the truth will prevail over propaganda. NATO's answer to disinformation is not more disinformation, but NATO's answer is to make sure that facts, the truth, prevails. And we have to defend our cyber networks so they are not manipulated. Let me also add that, of course, NATO has a role, nations have a role, governments have a role. We are working together, we share experiences, we help each other. But the media has a role. Free and independent press is perhaps the most important tool we have in countering disinformation and propaganda. So the work of journalists, asking the critical questions, checking the sources, checking the stories, that's really an important part of countering all the attempts to try to influence democratic processes through cyber attacks or disinformation.
That's a fact, or an alternative fact, we don't know anymore. The last question, who is willing, oh my God, so many people. Lady. Go ahead. You have the last question. Sorry for the others. We've tried as much as we could. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your thought-provoking and intriguing conversation. I'm Rabina Al-Hanati from Jordan. As new security challenges and increased responsibilities in the area of peacekeeping crisis management continue to evolve, we witness security cooperation with like-minded countries, potential partners, and aspiring members. Based on the Partnership for Peace program and the Mediterranean Dialogue, which expands and intensified practical, political, and military cooperation, yet does not extend security guarantees, my answer is regarding countries who already have strong defense capacities. What would be the next stage of cooperation in regards to technical issues? And what is your vision, or how do you foresee NATO's vision of a secure Middle East in the near future? Thank you.
It's a long story.
Yeah.
How long are you staying in Geneva? A long time.
Well, no, but what I can say is that NATO is not NATO is part of the answer to all the challenges we see in the Middle East, but NATO is not the only answer. The role of institutions here in Geneva, of the UN, of the EU, and of course of the nations themselves is of course the most important answer to the problems and the challenges in the Middle East. What we can do is, as I've stated many times, we can work with partners. Jordan is a very valued partner for NATO. And I think it's important to understand that Jordan is in one way a nation, an island of stability in the sea of instability. And it just underlines the importance of prevention is better than intervention. We have to help Jordan now, not wait until Jordan is in more troubles than the country is today. So one way of helping the Middle East is to support Tunisia, Jordan, other countries in the region which are stable, to help them to, stabilize the whole region, and Jordan is playing a key role. We have, for instance, trained Iraqi officers in Jordan, helping them to stabilize Iraq. Let me then end by saying that I have been working with Jordan for many, many years. The last years, as Secretary General NATO, we have training facilities in Jordan, working with Jordan on military capacity building. But I also worked with Jordan in Gavi. As I mentioned, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, the Queen of Jordan and the King of Jordan, they have been really front figures for that global campaign to immunize all children. So I'll just end by saying that we cannot choose between either immunization or strong military force. We need both. And immunizing children is a way to promote peace and stability, to have well-organized, democratic-controlled armed forces is another part of it. So actually I work for the same aim, regardless of whether I work for NATO or for Gavi. It's the same aim, a more prosperous and peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you for being so willing to answer all those questions. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for asking your questions, and thank you to GCSP and IHED for making this debate possible. Thank you all, and have a nice evening. Thank you very much.